Welcome, everyone. Good morning and welcome to GW's Graduate School of Education and Human Development's virtual preview day. We're so glad you could join us on this platform. As many of you know, our school is one of 14 within the George Washington University, and we are located right in downtown beautiful Washington, D.C. Our programs focus on preparing teachers, special educators, education experts, counselors, and organizational leaders. Today, we're joined by Dr. Shaista Khilji and Ms. Zoe King, who are going to be sharing an introduction to diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're very pleased that they have offered their expertise on this extraordinarily large topic. Dr. Khilji is a professor within our Human and Organizational Learning program. Dr. Khilji is the founding editor-in-chief of the South Asian Journal of Business Studies. And here at GW, she teaches primarily graduate level courses on leadership, change, diversity, and inclusion. Ms. King is a recent alum of our Master's in Organizational Leadership and Learning, and she now works at GW's Human Resources as a senior recruitment partner. Following their presentation, we will host a Q&A session. If you have questions that you think of throughout this presentation, if you could please feel free to type those in the chat box, which is at the very bottom of your screen, that would be helpful, and we'll make sure that we can try to get to all of those after the presentation. Dr. Khilji and Ms. King, thank you so much for joining us. I'll let you get started.
Thank you, Rebecca. This is Dr. Khilji. First of all, it's a pleasure to welcome you all to today's session. Zoe and I had been preparing to meet you in person, but I guess that wasn't meant to be. As I reflect upon the past 3 weeks, so much has changed. I know everyone has been saying that we're living through very uncertain times. Yes, in some ways, this global pandemic has brought us all together. However, I believe only time will tell if we as human society have changed forever, or maybe it's going to be business as usual when we return to normal. You may wonder, why do I mention this in my introduction? I would respond by saying that how we choose to live, work, organize, and lead through and after crises such as COVID-19 is critical to our understanding of diversity, equity, and inclusion, because it identifies who we are as people, how we think of others and ourselves, what values we aspire to, and what values do we put to work. So moving right into our presentation now, as you can see, the title of our presentation today is, Are You Seeing What I'm Seeing? An Introduction to Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, or DEI. I would begin by providing you a conceptual background of DEI. For example, what is diversity, what is inclusion, how does inclusion compare to exclusion, and the role of equity. Let's move on to the next slide since I'm talking about the agenda. There we go. All right. So as I said, this is what we're going to cover today. I will be providing you conceptual background of diversity. For example, what is diversity? What is inclusion? How does inclusion compare to exclusion and diversity? And what is the role of equity? Zoe will then join us and conclude by discussing best practices and the meaning of inclusive culture. And as Rebecca said earlier, we will wrap up by opening for question and answers. Before we start, I'd like to mention that this presentation is a microcosm or slice of the 14-week or a semester-long course that I teach in the Organization Leadership and Learning program at GW. Zoe, who's co-facilitating with me today, enrolled in my class in fall 2019. Since then, she has helped me run a number of these on-demand sessions outside the formal class structure. So let's get rolling, shall we? Let's move on to the next slide. So I begin by asking you to reflect on this very simple, however very deep question: who am I? And in reflecting on this question, I present you with two very different quotes. And I think these two quotes form the essence of what we want to discuss today. Please take a moment to review and reflect on these two quotes. The first quote is by Maya Angelou, and it refers to the idea of freedom and belonging. The second quote is attributed to Sufism and refers to the power of doubting and this lifelong quest for identity. So who am I? If you would like to respond to this question, what really stands out is a sense of belonging, freedom, and an unrelenting quest for identity. Let's move on to the next slide. So that brings me to our very first concept, which is diversity. The question is, what is diversity? Diversity is arguably one of the most commonly used terms, both within organizational and social settings. However, it has multiple definitions. For example, Kreitz, in an article published in 2008, defines diversity as any significant difference that distinguishes one individual from the other. And according to him, it covers a wide variety of factors that might be obvious to the other individuals, or they may also be hidden under the surface. Hence, this idea of hidden and unhidden, visible and invisible are quite important in the idea of diversity. Ely and Thomas in 2001 stated that diversity is a characteristic of groups of two or more individuals and typically refers to demographic differences of one sort or another among group members. Hence, this idea of social interactions and social categorization. Now, in order to adequately make sense of the concept that is diversity, we need to first and foremost identify the most common themes within a variety of definitions. And here are three that I want to highlight today. Number one, diversity is about differences. And an important question that we can raise here is, but differences of what and differences in what? Hold on to that question. Number two, diversity has both interpersonal and intergroup aspects. And thirdly, as I said earlier, diversity is about social categorization and social identification. Let's move on to the next slide. Now here we show diversity as an iceberg. And I said earlier that diversity has both surface level and deep level dimensions, as seen in this picture. Now, surface level diversity is readily visible or detectable and typically includes race, ethnicity, income, functional background, and tenure in the organization. There's no doubt that surface level diversity is a reality for many organizations and quite important for the society. But it is also worth mentioning that human behavior is very complex and individuals can and may categorize themselves in very different ways. Hence, there are other group differences based upon abilities, personality, attitudes, and values. These characteristics are considered deep level aspects of diversity. These are not visible, but nevertheless, they're very important in any discussion of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So let's move on to our next slide. Now I want to come back to this idea of identity. Who am I? The question that we began with. So one powerful way of looking at diversity is through the lens of identity. It has been argued that categories of difference, whether it is age, gender, or other demographic or non-demographic features, they're neither neutral nor detached from the individual. These do matter, both for individual identity as well as for differences as well. From this perspective, diversity management really requires actively managing individual identities. At first glance, identity and diversity may seem quite opposite because the word diversity refers to differences or being different from the other, and identity refers to similarity or being similar to the other. Hence, both self and the other are common and critical in diversity. By being different from one group, you can become similar to another group, right? Doesn't that make sense? Hence, in constructing identity, the idea of diversity becomes critical, and also vice versa. Deanka and Argan, in an article published in Harvard Business Review, argue that diversity means different things to different people. Based upon a survey, they identified three distinct categories of diversity. The first one was demographic diversity, which includes race, gender, sexual orientation, age, and some other features. And second one was experiential diversity, which, for example, includes affinities, hobbies, and abilities. And third one was cognitive diversity, that is how we approach problems and think about the world around us. Further, Deanka and Argan also argued that demographic diversity is tied to our identities of origin. That is, characteristics that classify us at birth and that we carry around for the rest of our lives. Experiential diversity, on the other hand, is based on life experiences that shape our emotional universe. Affinity bonds us to our people with whom we share some kind of our likes and dislikes. Experiential diversity, therefore, influences identities of growth. And finally, cognitive diversity makes us look for other minds to complement our thinking, what we might call identities of aspiration. From this perspective, diversity as a concept is quite dynamic and evolving. So let's recap. Identities of origin is what we're born with. Identities of growth, they give us a sense of security. Our likes and dislikes, they do change over time. And as a result, our affinity groups also change. Identities of growth dictate who we spend our time with. And finally, identities of aspiration is the way we look at the world. So let's move on to our next slide. Understanding multiple types of diversity, as the ones I've just explained, is particularly relevant in complex times when creative solutions are needed and where a single solution or a single universal approach no longer works. Each form of diversity is quite different and requires its own management strategy to effectively integrate people and to learn from each other. We know that diversity is quite complex. I call the word messy. Yeah, diversity is very messy. At the individual level, there is a conscious element to constructing our identity as well. So we can say that diversity is a journey, and like any other journeys, it has its ups and downs, right turns, left turns. Sometimes we walk through deserts and sometimes we walk through valleys. Let's move on to inclusion now. Next slide, please. So now that we've identified key aspects of diversity and described it as a journey, let's turn our attention to inclusion, which is a very important concept in any discussion of DEI. I would like to ask you to refer to your own experiences and share, if you feel comfortable, if you've ever engaged in identity cover, that is hiding important aspects of who you are. Raise your hand if you're comfortable doing so, if you've ever hidden who you are with others. In order to raise your hand, click on the hand icon next to your name. See if that's possible. All right. Let's refer to some research related to identity cover. Research indicates that employees who differ from most of their colleagues in either religion, gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic background, or even generation often hide important parts of themselves at work for fear of negative consequences. In my recent research, I found identity cover to be quite a common theme. As an example, a Latina immigrant who's practicing as an attorney spoke about identity cover as, begin quote, "It always struck me. I knew that I was the only person of color, the only different one. And one of these things that I learned was to figure out how to blend in with the dominant population. You just sort of adapt yourself to being less different and to assimilate to what the expectations are from the dominant group. And I did that quite a bit. I wouldn't necessarily share or be as open." Then she reflected further and stated, "I think by hiding who you are, the relationships became superficial rather than meaningful or deep." End quote. Diversity is a precursor to inclusion. Inclusion, however, isn't the same as diversity. Without inclusion, actually diversity can become quite problematic. Brown, in an article published in 2018, argued that inclusion is creating an environment where people can be who they are, that values their unique talent and perspective and makes them want to stay. Individual perception of inclusion is critical and impacts their experiences as well. Barak, in an article published in 2015, argues that employees have to perceive that they are esteemed members of their work group via experiences that satisfy their needs for both belongingness and uniqueness. Now, that's very important to the idea of inclusion. So summing up, diversity isn't equal to inclusion. Diversity doesn't guarantee inclusion. In order to create inclusive workplace, or in order to think about or conceptualize inclusion, we need to think about belongingness and we need to think about uniqueness at the same time. So let's move on to our next slide. Here's another important concept that I want to mention. In order to understand inclusion, we need to understand exclusion. Now, Shore argues that to understand inclusion, you have to understand exclusion. Barak, and Daya, in an article published in 2014, argued that an exclusionary workplace is based on the perception that all workers need to conform to pre-established values and norms that are determined by the mainstream. On the other hand, an inclusive workplace is based on a pluralistic value frame that respects all cultural perspectives that are represented amongst its employees. In sum, inclusion must fulfill at least 3 conditions. Number 1, equal opportunity for members of socially marginalized groups, providing support for members of non-marginalized groups, and finally, supporting employees in their efforts to be fully engaged at all levels of the organizations and to be authentically themselves. So let's move on to our final concept, which is equity, right? So far we've covered diversity and inclusion. Let's move on to our next slide. Equity. Now, it's important to wrap up these concepts by referring to equity. I argued that diversity is a precursor to inclusion, and without inclusion, that is creating an environment where people can be who they are and what their values are that are unique to them, diversity can in fact become quite problematic. Equity is ensuring fairness and justice to address structural imbalances. Therefore, by focusing on equity, we start paying attention to structural unfairness. By doing so, we move beyond numbers, which diversity somehow is measured as, to paying more attention to experiences and processes. I hope that how I've described each concept, that is diversity, equity, and inclusion, makes sense to you. Let me turn over to Zoe, who would focus on best practices and developing inclusive cultures. Over to you, Zoe.
Thank you, Dr. Khilji. And if we could hop on to the next slide, we're going to be talking about some best practices. So we've talked about diversity, we've talked about inclusion and exclusion, but right now we want to kind of focus on what does it look like to create an equitable work environment and an equitable environment. So the first of that is developing a pipeline of diverse talent. So if we're going to commit ourselves to creating a workplace that is diverse, that celebrates people of all different backgrounds and experiences, we really need to focus on being intentional about how we're creating a pipeline of talent that is diverse. So this might look like maybe being a little bit more open-minded about what makes somebody successful in a certain role. That might look like looking to untapped resources for talent from places that we might not necessarily usually look. And really, again, just being intentional about making sure that our candidate pools are diverse and they're bringing different experiences to the table. We also want to assess the current environment in the organization. So Dr. Khilji talked a lot about diversity isn't equal to inclusion. So when we bring that diverse talent into the organization, what are we doing to make sure that that talent feels celebrated and feels welcome in the organization? So it's important that we're intentional about looking at the current organizational landscape and making sure that we have supports in place so that we can retain this diverse talent and so that the environment that is present is one in which everybody can thrive. We also need to start confronting microaggressions. So one major element of the environment that we might look at in that organizational landscape are the presence of microaggressions and micro inequities. And this might look like a verbal or behavioral mistreatment that undercuts a person's feeling of belonging. And that can have a really lasting detrimental impact. We also want to leverage diversity to increase business performance. So in creating an equitable work environment, this might look like creating opportunities for people of different groups to cultivate personal and professional relationships. This can be done through mechanisms like employee resource groups, for example. We also want to develop accountability systems. If we are going to really, create this equitable work environment, these efforts aren't going to be long lasting if organizations aren't held accountable to a certain standard. So we need to make sure that these accountability systems are embedded within the organization through different mechanisms, different policies and procedures. We also want to train our employees and our managers. So we can't expect these behaviors to be inherent in every individual. So organizations really need to aid their employees and their managers with tools that will help them navigate and operationalize this idea of an inclusive and equitable work environment. We want to also offer peer support. So if the culture itself is to be inclusive, we need to create opportunities for peer support so that this is something that happens, really organically. And when we're looking at all of these best practices, we have to remember that these efforts won't be successful if we don't have absolute commitment from leadership. This is buy-in that we need to have from top of organizations down in order for this to have a long-lasting impact. Now, if you go to the next slide. So how do we kind of evaluate what an inclusive culture looks like? What are some success factors, some markers, so that we know that we're really building that inclusive culture? So first, people feel that there is a sense of psychological safety, meaning that they can freely express their opinions and their ideas without fear of retribution or judgment. There's a sense of involvement in teams. So all people in the organization not only are embedded in team environments, but there are supports in place to leverage these diverse teams and mitigate opportunities for conflict or adverse effects. There's also this feeling of being valued and respected. Dr. Khilji touched on this earlier, but inclusion is a meaning of perception. This is not something that you can measure, but it's really something that you feel and something that's self-reported by people in workplaces, in organizations. And that means the people in your organization report feeling that they matter and that their voice is respected and heard. There is influence on decision making. A lot of times we describe diversity as being asked to the prom and inclusion as being asked to dance. But I challenge us to take that a step further. Inclusion is being asked to dance and asked to pick the music that we dance to. We need to create a sense of ownership where all people's contributions are considered in the decision-making processes within the organization. We also want to focus on authenticity in our interactions. Again, inclusion is a feeling. So while we can do our best to create opportunities for this to arise, it does need to be cultivated organically, and we need to continue to be intentional about making sure that this comes up organically. And lastly, just recognizing, honoring, and advancing diversity, inclusion, and equity. This is lifelong work, and we have to be intentional every day in our interactions, in the way that we show up in our workplaces and in our work to make sure that we're partners in advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion. If we could hop to the next slide. I'd like to read a quote from the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. And as you can see here, it says, All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. If we could go to the next slide. So at the end of the day, diversity, equity, inclusion is a human issue. Often we see it play out as a political issue, a business issue, but at its core, it's a human issue. And I wanted to quote Dr. Khilji here by saying, focusing on respect, human dignity, and promoting human well-being. This should be at the core of our practice when we look at diversity, equity, inclusion. If we can commit ourselves to this notion, then we can all be partners in creating a more equitable and inclusive world. Thank you all.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much for sharing on these topics. It's so nice to hear about them. I know we were meant to be in person for this presentation. I'm so glad you were able to deliver this virtually. We do want to move over to a time of questions and answers. And so I'm going to introduce my colleague, Kimberly Settle, who's going to lead the Q&A. As a quick reminder to our attendees, you can type a question into our chat box, which is at the bottom of your screen, and we will pick up your question from there.
Great. So thanks, Rebecca. Everybody feel free to type your questions into the chat, use that Q&A function. We'll do our best to answer them and go through them as they come in. Oh, I do have one question that's come in. It looks like just privately to me in the chat, and I encourage all of you to select the entire group as the recipient for your message so that everyone can see your questions as well. But this question says, I work for an organization that doesn't really value diversity or inclusion. How can I as an employee get buy-in from leadership?
Wow, that's a great question. And I think it's a question that gets asked a lot. How do I think the question is, how do I create buy-in within a culture that doesn't respect diversity, equity, and inclusion? And I think my response to that question really is that everybody is a leader within organizations. So oftentimes we give our leaders, we expect too much from our leaders or formal hierarchy, based on their formal hierarchy. I would say that if you want to create a culture of where diversity, equity, and inclusion are encouraged, then you need to do that in your individual work as well, in your interactions with other individuals as well. And that would be one. So show through or demonstrate through your actions, demonstrate through your values as well. And secondly, I would say that whenever you get an opportunity, talk about the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion. How business decision, if your organization is really big on business decision or bottom line, how bottom line can be improved through the use of creating inclusive workplaces, and how important it is for individuals to feel respected, individuals to feel that they are being included in decision making in order to become productive members within the organization. So I would say twofold. Demonstrate in your action, in your own values, in your interaction with other individuals, and try to also educate those around you in formal position of authority as well.
Great, thank you. So we've got a ton of questions pouring in through both the chat feature and the Q&A feature. We'll start with the Q&A feature. This is a big one. But we'll do our best to answer this one from an anonymous attendee that asks, To what extent is content about DEI covered across all the GSHED programs?
Should I answer that question, Kimberly?
I think that you could definitely answer it for the HOL department, and then maybe Rebecca or Monique can talk a little bit about why DEI is important to all of our programs, and it'll tie nicely into my next question that I have queued up.
Yeah, so DEI is an important concept which is covered in a number of our courses. However, we have recently built a course around DEI, and I offered it as an online class, as an on-campus class. Oh God, I'm blanking. This is 2020, correct? I'm going crazy here. Yes. So all right. So the course was offered in fall of 2019, if I'm not mistaken, and it's going to be offered this summer as well, and it's going to be offered in the fall semester as well. So it's really it's become a very popular course, and it's going to be offered multiple times during the year. And DEI is a concept that's also covered not only in that class, but also in other classes as well, particularly within the organizational leadership and learning program. And I'll let Rebecca talk about other programs.
Sure. So obviously diversity and inclusion is a very important topic to GW as a whole, as well as the School of Education and Human Development. So our Student Services Department has various initiatives that they're working on to make sure that these topics are discussed and that, are taken seriously amongst staff, faculty, and students. And then GW, of course, has their own initiatives as well. We're in the middle of a strategic planning process for the university, and so there's also been lots of ways that students have been able to give feedback in that vein. But I think each program takes the specifics of how they approach these topics independently, but there's sort of that overarching support from the university and the school.
Great. And this is a perfect follow-up from Katrina, who says, this is a very important topic. What made you put this as a priority for Preview Day?
Now that's a Rebecca question, right? Rebecca, do you want to respond to that question?
Sure. So I think it goes back to what I had just mentioned, that this is a priority for the university and for our school, and so it was something we definitely wanted to highlight. We were also looking for topics that applied to all students. So of course I mentioned the variety of programs that we offer, and so when we're looking for topics for these types of sessions, we have to look for topics that apply to everybody or are interested to or of interest to a large population. And so hopefully we were correct in assuming that this topic was something that would apply to a wide variety of our demographics.
Excellent. Okay, so from the chat, this participant says, I currently work for an organization that values diversity and equity. On the other hand, there is problems in the implementation aspect. Do you have advice on the implementation of these concepts? And I think this ties into that very first question that we were asked earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. I can take that one. I think, in any organization, when we think about implementing, a new program, a new procedure, there's always going to be that sense of growing pains in the beginning. I think it's great to hear that you already have buy-in from your organization, and that tends to be one of the biggest obstacles in doing this type of work. So I think that it's really important that you leverage that buy-in, leverage that sense of collective understanding of how important this type of work is, and then kind of just begin to chart out what implementation and what that looks like for your organization. So we talked about some best practices in the session. this is something, you know, these are kind of broad. I think kind of those next steps when we think about implementation is really tailoring it to what is going to work in your specific workplace or your specific organization. Once you can start to frame these programs, these practices, through the lens of your organization's values, your organization's culture, it's going to be a lot easier for your senior leadership, for your colleagues to be able to kind of picture what this, you know, what these will look like in your landscape. So, you know, I would really just say taking a look at these overarching concepts and how you can, you know, best apply those to your specific organization's needs.
Great. This question from Monica: is it possible to develop burnout if you appear to be the only person advocating for diversity, inclusion, and equity within your work environment? If so, how can you minimize or prevent this burnout from happening?
I can take that question. And Monica, you're absolutely right. I recently finished interviewing a number of DEI practitioners, and one thing really stood out is the taxing impact of their work. I didn't come across a single DEI practitioner who didn't talk about the external pressures that they were faced with and the internal pressures they were faced with and the challenges they were faced with in implementing their work. I can talk a little bit about the strategies that could be helpful when you feel that you're faced with those pressures inside and outside the organization. I would say, based on what I've heard from other DEI practitioners talk about is be forgiving of yourself. I mean, know that we all make mistakes, own those mistakes, and become better the next day. Some people talked about having a personal coach and joining affinity groups to work through the personal nature of DEI. These are some suggestions that could be very helpful for practitioners and those interested in DEI work and are feeling extreme pressure both inside as well as from the outside of the organization.
Excellent. So we are approaching the end of our slotted time, which was so quick, and we have tons of great questions, but this will be our last question for today. So this question says, I work in K through 12. What are some ways that we can increase inclusion within the classroom?
Okay, so the question is, how can we increase inclusion within the classroom environment? So I would suggest using the same tools that Zoe has talked about. And I think the most important tool is creating a psychological safe environment for the students where they feel respected, where they feel that they can ask any question, and where they feel that their sense of dignity is being respected by everyone in the classroom. So having an honest conversation with the students in the classroom with respect to what is considered diversity, how critical, how important it is in the learning environment, and how important it is for us to openly share who we are as individuals and for others to respect each other. I would say really that would be the most foundational aspect of creating inclusive culture, whether it is a $500 billion company or a small classroom. I think the same philosophy would hold true in all settings.
Wonderful. So this is the end of our masterclass. Thank you to Dr. Khilji, thank you to Zoe King, and everybody else who's joined us today. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of your questions. There were many that were excellent. We look forward to seeing you at some of our other virtual preview day events this week, and hopefully welcoming you to the GSHED community later this year.
Thank you all. Be safe.